Now we are going to move to the canvas container. So we'll create a div, give it a width and height, and center it in the page. And also we're going to give it a border. So let's go ahead and do this. Okay. Let's give it an ID container. Okay. So we will place the canvas later when we learn canvas inside the div. Okay. So now we are going to style this container. So you're gonna access it using its ID, which is container. And as we said, we're gonna give it a width of 500 pixels and a height of 400. Okay. Let's also give it a border. So you're going to go for 1 pixel for the width and a solid style. And for the color of the border, I'm going to go for a blue color. So we're going to use the RGBA function to use some transparency. So I'm going to use the values 122, 174, 229, and for the transparency I'm going to go for 0.5. Let's refresh the page. Okay, so we can see our canvas container there. Okay, now let's center it using the margin property. So we're going to add some top and bottom margins of 10 pixels and auto for the left and right sides to center it. Now let's create the buttons we see at the bottom. Okay, so we're going to create a div and then place all these buttons inside the div. Okay, so let's write a comment, buttons. Okay, so let's create our div. So we're going to give it a class for styling. I'm going to call it input container 2. Okay, and then inside this container we're going to have the erase button, and we're going to place the button inside a div. So we're going to create a div and give it a class input 2. So all the buttons are going to have the same class, or all the containers of the buttons are going to have the same class, input 2. So what we're going to give this container a width of 399 pixels, and then all the buttons, all the containers of the buttons are going to have a width of 1/3 of that, so 133 pixels. Okay, so inside the div, the button is going to be a span. So we're not going to use the button tag because the span is going to allow us to do things that we can't do with the button. So I'm going to call this span, or give it an ID erase. So we're going to use this ID later in the jQuery code. Okay, and also I'm going to give it a class button, that we're going to use to style each of these buttons. Okay, so the other two buttons are going to follow the same rule. Okay, so the second one is save, and the third one is reset. Okay, so let's write some text inside the span for each of them. So the first one is going to say erase. The second one is going to say save, and the last one is going to say reset. Okay, now let's go to the CSS file and style our elements. So let's style the containing div. So we're going to give it a width of 399 pixels. Okay, and we're going to center it using the margin property. Okay, so let's save this and refresh. For some reason we don't see the live preview. Okay, now let's move to the input2 class. Okay, so we're looking here as the erase, save, and reset buttons. Okay, so we are going to access the class input2, which corresponds to the containers of these buttons. Okay, so we are going to set the width to 1/3 of the total width of the container, which is going to be 133 pixels. Okay, and also we're gonna change the text color to this blue color. So the code of that color is 5BB4E7. Okay, and also let's give these a bigger font size so that we increase the font size there. Okay, so I'm gonna go for a font size of 1.3 EM. Okay, now before we continue, let's just move to the buttons and give them some background color so that we can see them. So we're going to access the buttons using the button class, and let's go for the background and set that to a white color. Okay, so now we can see our buttons. So if we go back to the input2 class, let's make all the buttons float to the left. Okay, so that they are all side by side. So float left. Okay, and we can see space between the buttons because we have specified the width of the containing div of the buttons. Okay, so the buttons are centered thanks to the properties of the body element, text align center. Okay, and now let's style the buttons. So let's give them a height, okay, to get there. So we're going to go for a height of 50 pixels. Okay, so let's just refresh our live preview to see this working. Let's add some padding. 10 pixels. Also, let's add some border radius of 3 pixels. Okay, that looks fine. Okay, and also let's make the text look bold, just like that. I'm going to use the font weight property. I will set it to bold. Okay, and also we're going to set the cursor to a pointer. Okay, and now it looks fine. Now let's add some border shadow or box shadow. So if we look at the buttons with a white background, we can see the box shadow there. Okay, so you're going to have some vertical shadow and we're going to set it to 4 pixels. So let's go ahead and do this. So box shadow, so that's going to be 0 pixels horizontally, and we're going to set it to 4 pixels vertically, which means 4 pixels to the bottom. And for the color, I'm going to go for a black color. I'm going to use some transparency, so we're going to use the RGBA function. So it's going to be 0, 0, 0 for black, and for the transparency, I'm going to go for 0.2. Okay, and now if we look at the buttons in white background, we can see the box shadow there. Okay. Again, as we've done before, the box shadow property, we need to duplicate it and add WebKit and Moz. Okay. Now let's move to the hover state of the buttons. So let's access the button class and then colon hover. Okay. So when we hover on the buttons, we're going to change the background color, and also the text color will change to a white color. So let's set the color property to white for text. Okay. And now we need to change the background color. Okay, so you're going to use a linear gradient. So we're going to use the same color we used for the title. Okay, which is this one. Okay, again, we'll need to duplicate this line like we did there. So let's just copy paste the whole code. Okay, and now when we hover on the buttons, we can see the color changing. Okay, now let's move to the active state of the buttons. So button class colon active. So what happens when we click on a button? The button moves slightly down, okay? And basically what's happening here is that we're just covering the box shadow, okay? So what we need to do, as we did before, we will need to change the position property of the button to a relative position. And in the active state, we are going to set the top property to 4 pixels. Okay. So let's save this and make sure that this is working. Okay, it's working. Now we have finished the skeleton and decoration of our app. So in the next video, we are going to learn HTML5 canvas.